All right, good afternoon. Hopefully we're back from lunch. Our first speaker up this afternoon is from RWE. We have a pair of speakers. And RWE, as you may know or may not know, Ashwood Solar 1 project is a KYMEA Owensboro project, 86 megawatts that is going to come online in December of 2022 or thereabouts. So that's Ashwood Solar 1. RWE is here to talk about solar and energy storage technology overview. We have with us today Joshua McNeely. He's the Senior Development Manager. Josh leads RWE's solar origination, development, and M&A efforts on behalf of its Eastern United States development team and various Southeast and Northeast markets with a strong focus on PJM. Since entering the solar industry in 2007, he has worked on projects both in domestic and foreign markets across the United States, North America, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. As the Senior Development Manager, he brings over 12 years of project development expertise, along with a strong track record in siting, permitting, contracting, financing, and constructing large-scale utility-scale solar or photovoltaic PV projects. For RWE, he has developed over 1.5 gigawatts of early-stage greenfield projects in MISO and PJM, completed over $300 million in M&A transactions, and manages development efforts on a pipeline of over 1 gigawatt in Kentucky, Ohio, Virginia, Tennessee, and Louisiana. Josh holds a BS, Bachelor's of Science in Organizational Studies and Economics from the University of California, Davis. We also have with us Christina Cazares, is that correct, Michelle? Director, Energy Storage. Ms. Cazares is responsible for energy storage business development and commercialization activities at RWE across the United States, with a focus on the Midwest and Northeast regions. Ms. Cazares joined the RWE Renewable Americas, was formerly known as EON Climate and Renewables, in 2013 as a solar development manager, and focusing on developing the company's utility-scale solar project pipeline in the Western and Southwestern markets. Ms. Cazares has over 10 years of experience working in renewable energy industry, focusing on solar, wind, and now energy storage development. She has been the lead developer in all of RWE's operating energy storage projects in the U.S. Christina holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So I'd like to welcome both of them. I guess we're here to give them, we'll give them applause here as on site.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so we just wanted to, walk through a couple different items for you, give you an overview on RWE, walk you through, just general characteristics of the Ashwood Solar 1 project, and then we'll talk a little bit about trends we're seeing on the technology side with a shift to bifacial modules and some of the gains that those provide to us in the industry. And then I'll hand it over to Christina at the end, and she can talk about battery storage, capital uses, and a little bit about what we've done in that space in the U.S. and abroad. Okay, so I guess before we jump into this, I think it's interesting for us to learn. Up until last year, we were operating in America under EON. There was a merger / asset swap that was completed October of last year with RWE, where the generating and renewable portfolio transferred over to RWE. Both of those entities, both EON and RWE, have a longstanding history in Kentucky. EON being, former owner of LGEKU up until I believe about 2014, and RWE, in fact, was the Kentucky American Water Company owner for just a little bit as well. So familiar with Kentucky, excited to be back with this project. Moving forward, RWE as a group is one of the larger renewable energy companies worldwide. We focus on 4 different technologies, so onshore wind, offshore wind, utility scale, PV, and energy storage. And the kind of geographic focuses for us are across North America, Europe, and the Asia Pacific regions. To date, I think we're just above 9 gigawatts of generation. 2.5 gigawatts generation under construction coming online in the next year or two. And an investment budget in the renewable sector of $2 billion annually. So very excited about what the platform in RWE provides us, and then moving forward. A 86 megawatt project, as was previously discussed. It is in Lyon and Caldwell counties in southwest Kentucky. It's a 161 line tap with LG under our PPA of December 2022. The project will be comprised of bifacial solar modules, which we'll get into the difference between. We're using a single axis tracking technology. So this is when you orientate the panels north to south, and they track the sun east to west, and then central inverters. The project site, as it's comprised today, is 8 different landowners. It's roughly 1,600 acres. Most of that land has been previously disturbed for agricultural purposes, and I think the vast majority of it to date is row crop. The process going forward for any new generators or transmission projects in the state of Kentucky, obviously there's the state siting board, the Kentucky State Board on Electric Generation and Transmission Siting, which is kind of the largest discretionary permit that would be outstanding on the project. So we're moving into that process in the next couple of weeks to kick that off. Then there's a handful of other projects, including some work with the U.S. Army Corps on some potential crossings and mitigant for any wetland impacts, both temporary or permanent. I think on this slide, we just wanted to talk about kind of reference the geographic location of Ashwood, and then talk about some of the key benefits that we see. So obviously, renewable energy being kind of the primary driver. From our previous discussions with KYMEA, the project consists of roughly 14% of your load. I'll let you guys, fact check me on that later. We look at the impact for direct jobs. So the project as it's slated today will create roughly 200 to 250 local construction jobs. We're forecasting roughly a 9 to 12 month duration of construction. We look at another benefit, specific to community benefits being local tax revenue. And so we're in the process of implementing an industrial revenue bond on the project to ensure that the property taxes flow through to the local communities rather than up to the state. So we see some enhanced benefits there to the local community. Additionally, there's, quite a bit of revenue stream that would stay in the community of the participating landowners. So the way that solar projects are usually structured is roughly a 35-year life. In our project, we're across, as I mentioned, 8 parcels. So 8 families will be receiving benefit of lease revenue for a 30 to 40 year project life cycle. And then we look at also indirect impacts to the local community. All that construction activity that will take place obviously flows down to local restaurants, gas stations, hotels, and other community members. I think when we look at other benefits and impacts and mitigants towards those impacts, we've taken some special considerations for this project. So we're proposing to the state vegetative screening. This primarily is driven to mitigate any viewshed issues for neighbors that may not be participating in the project, or folks that just don't like looking at solar panels. We're also using native seeding underneath the panels on any disturbed grounds as part of our erosion control plan. We also plan to use pollinators in select locations around the project as a enhancement to local habitat. And then another unique item is, folks always say, what happens at the end of the life of the project? We're in the process of putting together a decommissioning plan, which will include a decommissioning bond that will ensure that, at the end of the 35-year useful life of a project, that all of the project gets pulled out and the lands get restored as close as possible to their pre-construction state. In addition to that, we're in discussions with locally on some local partnerships with colleges and universities specific to the STEM programs in the area. On the next slide, I think, big conversation in our industry is driven a lot towards the switch in monofacial modules, which are your traditional module, which would have glass exposing the solar cell on the front side, to a shift to bifacial. So 2020 has been kind of the coming out year for most manufacturers, where we're seeing kind of a unilateral shift in manufacturers to deliver bifacial modules. And the difference is pretty simple. It's essentially glass on both sides of the panel, so eliminating the plastic laminate on the back. So if you look on this picture, this is a very similar design to what we will have implemented on the Ashwood Solar project. These are bifacial modules. You can see they're fully transparent on the back. What that essentially does is it allows both sides to be exposed to the sun. So you have the front and the back side exposed, and you get gains from both the direct sunlight hitting the top side of the panel and also the indirect refracted light hitting the back of the panel. On the next slide we can go to. I think most people are asking why this is important. So we look at incremental gains in our industry, knowing that we compete against coal, natural gas, and nuclear in the commodity space of electricity. And all gains are significantly important for both us as developers, owners, and operators of projects, but then also to customers like KYMEA. And so if you compare mono modules, so traditional solar panels versus the bifacial modules, what we on the same watt class is roughly a 3 to 10% gain by switching to bifacial in production. So while not massively material, that's pretty material in our industry. A couple factors that impact kind of what your bifacial gain would be are listed to the right. I won't go through all of them. I'll just move on to a couple the key ones we see as being the strongest drivers. So trackers, for example. So I think that the two main items, all of these factors will impact your production gains that you see in bifacial. GCR is ground coverage ratio. So essentially what that is how far apart they're spaced. And so the farther you can space, the more refraction you have for reflected light you can absorb on the back of the panels, which increases your production. Clearance is the same kind of concept. And then smart capture, when we talk about smart capture, so trackers traditionally had been, there was an algorithm that was put in on trackers that was essentially, they would have a predetermined sun track. In smart tracking technology, there's a machining algorithm that essentially allows trackers to adapt based on actual real-time conditions over time at a specific site. The other items that we see impacting on the tracker side are orientation. So orientation, typically most trackers, they go from 55 to 60 degrees plus or minus. So with bifacial, the broader you can track, the more gains you see. And then one of the other kind of key factors we see in production gains received from bifacial module is albedo. And so albedo is essentially what ground coverage you have underneath. And so in certain instances, if you can put artificial ground covering, which isn't always applicable, you can see higher albedo gains. And so, if you look at what traditionally we have underneath modules, it's usually dry sand if we're out in the desert of Texas, or in other locations where, we have to seed for erosion control, it's grassland. And so to take a quick feedback from these numbers that we see here, so an albedo of 20%, so what you'd get on kind of dry sand, what that equates to is roughly a 6% gain in production. And you see as you move into white, more reflective surfaces like snow, you have a higher albedo gain. And so if you looked at what a 50% albedo gain would give you versus a regular traditional solar module, you'd get 15% plus. The impact of snow we see, in areas maybe further north where there's, material snowfall throughout the year. We usually see our production drop in the winter months With bifacials, you actually see less of a drop because you still have the indirect incident light that can hit the back side of the panel. With an albedo that's pretty high, you could still realize significant gains comparatively.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you about our energy storage program at RWE. As Josh mentioned and the introduction, I'm a director for our energy storage program, so I cover all our development, origination, and commercialization of all of our energy storage projects across the U.S., currently focusing on the Midwest and the Northeast markets. So the slide here are just reflect a common and typical applications that we've seen across the U.S. for energy storage projects. I can take it column by column. Renewable integration. This is the most common one and most applicable one here today. If we were to co-locate a battery project on a solar or wind project, here are some of the applications that could be most commonly used for the battery. So for the most typical ones would be the most popular ones, are load shifting and clipped energy capture. For load shifting, here we are able to take the production from the solar plant and store it and shift it to a later time in the day where it's most economical. So in theory, we'll be charging the battery in the morning when prices are typically low, storing it, and then deploying it in the afternoon, late afternoon or early evening when prices are high and demand is high as well. So we can help satisfy and meet that peak demand. For clipped energy, in this scenario, batteries can be charged with the excess solar output when the solar inverter hits its peak rating and would otherwise begin clipping or not producing. So here we're able to take that energy and clip it, if you will, and store it for use at a later time. For firming and smoothing, that would be the last one. This is the most common application where we can further enhance the production of the output from a solar project. If you look for solar projects, they're really only efficient on cloudless, really sunny days. So what happens if you start taking a closer look at your production curve for solar curve, you'll notice a few spikes and some discrepancies with the production, and that's typically because if the cloud comes over, then production does ramp down. If you add on a battery, we're able to smooth out that curve and create a customized production for your needs and also provide more predictability on the grid. Moving on to the next use case here for transmission and distribution, the most common application we've seen under this category is T&D deferral. You may have heard some NWA RFPs, so those are non-wires alternatives. I believe those are mostly more popular in the Northeast, specifically New York. They've had several they've issued a few of these NWAs in the last few years. For T&D deferral, it's just as it sounds. It's where a utility uses the battery or energy storage to defer the need to upgrade the transmission and distribution equipment or to extend the life of the existing transmission and distribution equipment. So again, here this adding a battery can defer the need for these upgrades until the utility is best able to provide a game plan for those upgrades or even for the funds for those full traditional upgrade improvements. Moving on for market participation, here these are really some of the markets that we can generate the most revenue in. And so for ancillary services, the most common one is frequency regulation, and here's just really smoothing out any frequency deviations on the grid and providing a smoother shape there. Same thing with energy arbitrage. Energy arbitrage is very similar to peak shifting. And then moving on to microgrids. Here with microgrids, we've seen energy storage projects being used in scenarios or cities, military bases, islands where standalone energy storage systems used DG systems, distributed generation systems, and can operate in parallel or independent of the energy grid that it's servicing. Can take the next slide, please. And this slide here just shows a snapshot of all of RWE's energy storage operating assets. So we've had some recent examples. In 2017, we completed our Iron Horse project in Tucson, and that was co-located with a solar project. So it's battery plus storage And then shortly thereafter, we completed our Texas Waves 1 projects, and those are battery projects co-located with 2 of our wind farms down in East Texas. And then we've got a handful of international projects located overseas in Sweden, UK, and Germany. And these use cases are kind of a mix of everything from the previous slide I just showed. So for Iron Horse here, we use, this project is being used for frequency regulation and voltage control with the local utility, which is Tucson Electric Power. For the Texas Waves projects, here we're using these batteries for frequency regulation and for ancillary service participation in the fast frequency response market. And then the projects overseas, again, they're used for a mix of ancillary services, frequency regulation, microgrids, as some of these batteries are located in islands off the coast of these countries. And the technologies here vary, again, they're all lithium ion. However, the chemistries do vary from one location to the other as we've elected to use that technology since it better supported the use case for the actual project. And this is just a snapshot of our operating assets. We do have a pretty robust development pipeline in the mix covering the entire country. So still looking to add on to this list, and hopefully it'll keep growing. And that's all I had. And we can pause here for any Q&A for either Josh or myself.
Well, this is Doug. Thank you very much. That was terrific. We have certainly have some questions from KYMEA, and then Heather, you can tell us if anybody typed any in. First of all, we are super excited about this project, and we can't wait for December of 2022 to get here. So that's something we're all anxious to see and see these things in action, and it won't be long before they're here. Some of the questions we have to do with how do you plan to address the vegetation at the site? You talked about natural seeding. Do you have to mow around it, or what do you have to do to keep the vegetation down?
Yeah, so there's a couple different solutions to that. So we've even seen some very interesting ones from some friends down in Tennessee recently. The use of sheep and other animals, but typically we would choose a species of grass that doesn't grow very high. So it's very impactful for us in our selection of ground coverage to have something that would grow and shade the module. I think mowing creates some concerns for us as well. But the most traditional, I think, solution is a selection of a grass species that doesn't grow very high. And so it would limit our use of pesticides. That's always an issue. It would limit our use of mowing. But there are a couple different creative solutions. I think our preference would be the latter, though.
Okay, very good. These next two questions have to do around covering the panels. That is, how do you clean the panels? We're probably talking about dust or debris that gets on them. And secondly, how does snow and ice affect the panels? I think you answered some of that already with the bifacial aspect of it. But how do you clean the panels, and how often do you need to clean the panels?
Yeah, so good question. So traditionally it's more or less pressure washing with distilled water. So you don't want to put chemicals on. You don't want to put anything that would spot on the module. The cleaning varies by project location, and so the kind of computer electronics behind these systems are relatively robust and will monitor production versus what's modeled as far as what's expected from the production. And so usually as production starts to fall off, we would schedule crews. I think if you look at just general examples, they're usually done on a quarterly basis or a biannual basis, depending on your location. Obviously, if you're in a more dusty environment, say you're on the desert in West Texas, that frequency would be sped up a little bit. As far as snow and ice, we have the good thing about solar is we've got a pretty low variance year to year, and so we're able to look at production simulations on different site locations and model out the impact of weather-related events. In the event of snow, obviously you did see a drop in your overall production. I think the points made earlier about Albedo and the bifacial module do increase what we would assume is losses during those periods. But snow is an item that affects the overall production of a system.
Okay.
Josh, this is Heather from KYMEA. We do have one additional question. Can you expand a little bit about the promoting pollinators? How many acres out of the 800-acre site that is Ashwood would be planted in pollinator-friendly species?
We don't have the specific calculation for that yet. I think what we're looking at is specific corridors on the vegetative screening area for planting of those. I think we'll have to present a more comprehensive plan to the guiding board and the Public Service Commission, and that will be all fully detailed. But we don't have a specific acreage amount.
Is there any more there? I have a couple others, and I think we can turn you guys loose. Staffing, we assume there's no one at the site, but maybe that's the wrong assumption. How would you define staffing for the site?
So I think a common question that's frequently asked in our industry. So solar panels don't usually, or solar farms usually don't have kind of an on-site maintenance guy. And so we look at regional operators, someone that can get to the site within a couple hours if there's, electrical short, a downed event, or any other kind of catastrophic event. But to your point, yeah, you don't usually have a single operator sitting at a site. What we do have is dedicated regional teams throughout that operational period. So we have a handful of folks, and then there's a much broader analytical team that's monitoring the projects live time virtually. So
very good. Did you have another? Okay, go ahead, Heather.
Josh, this takes a little bit of a different turn. Can you talk about battery storage and how much is included in that Ashwood project, and if there are any batteries, what type?
Sure. So Ashwood is a solar PV project. So we don't have any batteries included to date. If there was interest on behalf of the utility to explore that, obviously we could discuss that. Different on the Ashwood project, that would have to be a secondary project. We've been through the interconnection process with LGAU and executed that interconnection agreement that was solely based on PV only. Christina, maybe you could talk a little bit more and elaborate on energy storage if needed.
Sure. If there's a follow-up specifically on storage, I mean, as Josh mentioned, it would be a secondary addition to the project, or as it's currently contracted, it is solar only.
Christine, we've seen sort of a rule of thumb of maybe 60% of a solar site could be capable of being paired with battery. Is that a rule of thumb you used, or is that something that it varies by application?
Application and also by region. We've seen an average as low as 25% of sizing the battery of 25% of the solar PV output, and going all the way up to 75%, where there's a market for it. In certain areas, there's really no need to go that high of sizing a solar and battery project 1-to-1. And so typically we're looking minimum of a 25% in order just to be able to do effective peak shaving, if you will, or load shifting. But the minimum size is probably around 25% as a rule of thumb for the industry. And then the upper limit is really just seeing if there's a market for it in terms of, oversizing a battery and going a 1-to-1 scale, or maybe going at least around 50%. So the upper limit is really dependent on the location and the application.
And those are like 2-hour batteries or 4-hour, or is that also?
Yeah, so we have seen in the market some longer duration batteries, but most commonly for peak shifting, we're looking around a 2-hour system for those that have a capacity market. So like if you're in an ISO, so MISO, PJM, New England ISO, or even California CAISO, It's roughly around a 4-hour market or 4-hour duration in order to be able to play in the capacity market. But for standard applications, we're right around the 2-hour duration mark.
Would it be difficult to add batteries in the future to the Ashwood site?
We would just have to look at the interconnection to make sure that there's capacity on that point of interconnection and figure out if there's some available land. But it wouldn't be it wouldn't be too difficult of an exercise to explore. But that's something that we can take on, should the utility express interest there. Very
good. Any other questions, Heather, from the chat? All right, terrific. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you. Wish you could have been here, but we'll see you soon we start doing town halls and all those other things that are coming along. So thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation.
Thank you.
Our next speaker I have in front of me is Steve Killian from Boyd Caterpillar. Steve's in the division of electric power, gas, and microgrid products, and microgrid's certainly a hot topic now. Steve graduated from Purdue University in 1974. Immediately went to work for a medium-speed engine power generator manufacturer, primarily oil, gas markets, and cogeneration. Relocated to Chicago, working with dealers in the Midwest and Eastern Canada. Steve relocated to Kansas City, working for a dealer for 8 years, and then moved to Louisville 32 years ago. So he's been here a long time now. Worked for GE Energy Rentals, a new startup providing mobile power and temperature control equipment worldwide. Nearly 40 years experience with reciprocating gas engines, power generation projects, and that's certainly the type of project that maybe would fit well for us, something we wanted to look at. Prime power, base load, peak shaving, biogas, landfill gas, and low energy fuels. Industry and utility solutions for lower cost solutions is what Steve works on. Caterpillar introduced their microgrid products 4 years ago, including solar, energy storage systems, and hybrid microgrids. Notable projects in the last 5 years is Fort Knox, East Kentucky Power, Owen Electric, and NGK Sparkplug. So let's give a warm welcome to Steve.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Rob, to be here today. Quite frankly, it's nice to get out of the house. With this lockdown, I can say this is my third visit or out of the house over the last 3 months. So today, maybe backing up a little bit, I met Doug and Rob at a KYMEA meeting last fall. And there I gave a presentation to the utilities, kind of a more general presentation than what this one is today. And it was then that Rob and Doug alerted me of your potential power plant project, I'll call it. And since that time, we've had one meeting, have submitted a lot of data to Rob. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the RICE power plant, that terminology, RICE stands for reciprocating internal combustion engine. That word alone separates us from the turbine people, okay? So we're a recip. For those in the audience that are Kentucky-based, you probably recognize us by the Wayne Cat logo. Wayne Supply has been around over 105 years here in Kentucky, serving our communities. And just right before COVID hit, our owner took on the task of rebranding our company. Our owner, Monty Boyd, has owned our company for now 12 years. He purchased a company from the Wayne family, actually 2 sisters that were involved in the later years. But he also ran the company prior to that for 12 years, president and CEO. He's a Caterpillar guy through and through. In fact, right out of college, his first job was with Caterpillar. So he was with Caterpillar before we hired him, or before the Wayne family hired him. The Walker logo used to represent, 2 years later after buying Wayne, he bought the Caterpillar dealership in West Virginia. and now everything has been under one logo now, under the new Boyd Cat logo. So that's all fairly new. So here's where we're at as a Caterpillar dealership. We have essentially an assigned territory to service. We're throughout Kentucky, southern couple counties in Indiana, West Virginia, and southeastern Ohio. Across there, we have 21 locations, full service locations. So what does Caterpillar see today and in the future in the growing electric power business? More solar. And we've sure seen a lot of that, seems like, in the past year here in this state. More wind. Caterpillar's in the solar business, I'll show you later. We're not in the wind business. More battery storage. We're in that business today. More natural gas, primarily due to emissions, costs of operation, and natural gas is quite an inexpensive fuel today. And we're seeing more sophisticated customers in terms of integration of their electric and energy needs. Overall, Caterpillar has been in business in the power side of the business. Everybody recognizes us in the construction equipment, mining equipment. You drive down the interstate, you see a backhoe or whatever. We've been in the power business for 80 years, since 1939. Over 500,000 installations worldwide and 272,000 megawatts of power installed. Backup diesel, we're not going to talk about that today. That's your everyday backup standby generator used in various applications. Continuous power is primarily gas is fueled today. Nobody runs a diesel continuous here in the United States, emissions, costs of operation. But there's many, many sites overseas where diesels are still the standard and run 724. Our gaseous fuel products, for the most part, we're into biogas, landfill gases, and what we call low energy fuels. We can run down to 450 BTUs per cubic foot gas supply. Caterpillar also manufactures their own switchgear for the electric power needs, and we can integrate multiple sources. Here's what we see, how utilities are pretty much using our product today. And we have both high speed in the industry, that would be considered 1500, 1800 RPM product, medium speed, 720, 750 RPM, which is the primary product we want to talk about today. Reserve markets, wind and solar firming. I think if I understood Rob correctly, this power plant you're considering is to shore up that solar project as much as anything, peaking relative to the solar. Non-spinning reserve, black start. We do a lot of black start of gas turbines, regulation, a lot of distributed generation and peak shaving today. So this kind of and I'll send this out later, Rob. You said you were going to send my presentation to everybody, but there's a couple other attachments, and this will be one, some brochure information. But we cover the gamut on gas from 155 kilowatt up to approximately 10 megawatt. The bottom two engines, the GCM 16 cylinder and 20 cylinders, what I'm going to primarily talk about today. Those two products are manufactured in a plant in Kiel, Germany. Any other model designated with a G in front of it. The engine and the generator is assembled in a plant just north of here in Lafayette, Indiana. It's their biggest power plant in the United States. The CG product, it comes out of a plant in Mannheim, Germany. Natural gas standby. For years, NFPA didn't recognize natural gas as a standby fuel. It is today, and more people are seeking natural gas as a preferred for standby backup power in lieu of diesel. And just shows you again our capabilities on low energy fuels such as sewage gas, landfill gas, and the like. So really, we have 5 products, 5 sizes that fit well for power plant designs, if you will. The higher speed product, no doubt, would fit well in a 10 megawatt or less plant. And then the G20 CM34 fits well in 20 megawatt. Probably our niche would be 20 megawatt to 100 megawatt size rice plant. This is that medium speed engine. Where we're at today, we have 460 megawatt installed of electric power. Those engines too are used a lot in gas compression. There's another 670 megawatts. So the engine has a lot of history, a huge track record, and that's just gas compression only. Many hours, millions of hours. We're not working with an engine that was just designed and put on the market last year. Here's where these plants are in the United States and Canada right now. Anything from, I don't even know what the smallest one, I guess 10 megawatt up to 116 megawatt. That plant in Kansas has got 20 cylinders in it. It's used for peaking and to shore up their wind out there, their wind generation. And today, I think that's the largest rice electric power plant in the nation. But I also want to point out 2 other projects here that I think you guys just getting going and started, it'd be worthy of you to contact these folks, talk to them. One is 2 plants there in Minnesota. They're named Fairmont and Owatonna. And furthermore, I have that same video today, Doug, that I showed you and Rob, and I know you know, I think he's the GM up there, but he's pictured in that. So I think you could obtain a lot of information from him. Their first plant was put in 5-6 years ago, and their other plant was just the 20-cylinder engine, the Owatonna, was put in, I think, 2 years ago. So you got to ask yourself, why did the customer choose CAT a second time? The other one I think you guys may want to talk to is Western Energy. It's on the left side, second from the bottom there. That plant was just contracted. So there's very recent data, very scalable data in looking at that plant. That would be, from what I understand, would be on the upper end of maybe what you're considering. That's a 58 megawatt plant. But before COVID hit, Rob and I talked about maybe a plant tour and visiting one or both sites there in Minnesota. If that's still in the future, be happy to set that up and do that. So this is what the 20-cylinder engine looks like. Like I say, it's 720 RPM, 4-stroke, 20-cylinder. We're pushing almost 49% efficiency on this unit. Really, in this market, 10 megawatt machine, we really only have one competitor, really a viable competitor. That's Wärtsilä. That engine is made in Finland. And they've been in this marketplace a lot longer than our medium speed engine. But you'll find from a technical standpoint, the two engines are pretty equal. It's what separates us that I'll get into in various other forms. This slide's pretty messy. This is a brochure I'll send out again. It'd be easier read then, but the big thing we push at Caterpillar is reliability, the testing, the history, what we know of the engine, and flexibility. With Caterpillar, we like to sit down and design the plant, especially the control sequence and operation of the plant to your needs. I can tell you from experience, the competition pretty much gives you what they already have in the box, and that's what you get from them. I'm not going to dig too deep in the technical issues of the engine. The big thing there is what you guys would call the heat rate or energy consumption. That engine is at 7,100 BTUs per kilowatt hour. It's pretty low fuel consumption. The overall generator set weighs 360,000 pounds, and unlike the high-speed product where you would service it 4 times a year, you got oil changes, cost of ownership of oil, etc. This engine holds about 1,000 gallons of oil, and it has a separate module and centrifuge oil cleaning. So you never change the oil in the engine, you just add oil. I may have mentioned earlier, Caterpillar has their own manufacturing plant. They build their own switchgear, and whether it's traditional NEMA 208 to 13.8, we also manufacture what most utilities like is arc-resistant switchgear. So we bring the total package to the table: controls, switchgear, generator sets, and all the ancillary equipment. Caterpillar's been in the microgrid business for just 4 years now. That meaning we have Caterpillar solar panels, we have Caterpillar manufactured energy storage. Like our predecessors, our energy storage is, or the previous, what was their name, RWE, talked about the technology is lithium-ion batteries, and we build our energy storage currently in 250 kW blocks. Discharge times for whatever you want. In the next 6 months, we'll be building more in line of 1 megawatt blocks of energy storage. The reason for that, Caterpillar's developed their own inverter. It's a bidirectional inverter. So we have a 250 kW inverter today, and we'll have a 1 megawatt inverter probably in the next 6 months to introduce. The big thing here that too I want to mention is the MMC controller. The MMC controller is used when we integrate 2 sources plus of energy. So we can integrate solar with a gas electric generating plant. We can integrate solar with energy storage, gas electric generation. And what's nice about it, it pretty much automates versus hands-on operator in dealing with several sources of energy. So we can integrate, let's say on this project, your 80 megawatt of solar into the gas electric plant. This is just a quick shot and description. This was the first plant that Southern Minnesota put in. It was 25 megawatt, 4 of the 16 cylinders. And then, like you say, they followed 2 years ago with 4 of the 20 cylinders. Okay, here's where, this is about a 5-minute video. Should be an arrow pop up there for you to click on that. There we go. Whoop.
SIMPA, we're a wholesale electric provider to our 18 member systems. Our members are all municipal utility systems. All of our 18 member cities are in the state of Minnesota.
We operate in an organized energy market. It's called the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, or MISO. And MISO really dispatches all of our resources, all of the resources in the region.
The generation market has changed dramatically in the past several years to one that requires equipment that will start fast, load fast, has the ability to maintain efficiency at varying loads of generation.
We had a need to fill kind of an intermediate level of generation. We needed something that fit our needs. In this case, in the case of Fairmont, it was 25 megawatts. And the reciprocating engines from CAT fit that profile very well. MISO needs access to different generators that can fill in those needs when the wind either picks up unexpectedly or it drops off suddenly. And these reciprocating engines, the Caterpillar engines, are very quick responding.
Another benefit that we saw of this particular type of technology is the high efficiency, the low operating costs. We knew that if we went with reciprocating engine technology, we would get assets that are relatively economical to operate.
This is a 25 megawatt power plant driven by 4 Caterpillar CM34 16-cylinder engines. This equipment lends itself very well to that task. It starts fast, 0 to full load, 25 megawatts in 8 minutes. It has the ability to maintain efficiency, so it uses the same amount of fuel at full load as it does at half load.
These new cats, you start them up and you check things, make sure they're running, but they're very, very efficient and easy to work on.
Right from the very beginning, Ziegler made a commitment to SIMPA and let them know that we would support the new CM34 engines.
Ziegler Power Systems has been at the table. They've had a number of people from their team working with us and with Caterpillar through the engineering process. We're very pleased to have that local support that we get from Ziegler.
We as Ziegler Power Systems want to make sure that we're there helping them every step of the way, and by providing the product support, the after sales service, that's our main goal.
Our experience with the Fairmont plant with Caterpillar was a very positive experience, and a relationship we were happy to continue at Owatonna. But we knew we needed more capacity there.
November 2010, we had a flood down here that significantly affected the operation of the power plant, took it out of service, and so we needed to look at an alternative. We had close to 30 megawatts worth of generation that ceased to exist.
We needed something a little larger than Fairmont, and fortunately, after we had built Fairmont, Caterpillar came out with their 20-cylinder engine. The G20 CM34 engines were a better choice for us at Owatonna because it allowed us to get up to the 38, 39 megawatt project we were looking for, and still just with 4 engines.
With the installation of the CM34 engines in Fairmont and now the new expansion in Owatonna, this will really help Caterpillar facilitate and expand their footprint of more plants here in North America.
Our plant manager and project manager had very specific design criteria in terms of making the unit easy to operate. And Caterpillar was very willing to work with us on the layout and design, where some of the other vendors were less willing to change their designs.
We're responsible really to a lot of small communities in the state of Minnesota to spend their money wisely. The willingness of Caterpillar to work with us, to work with the agency, to understand our needs, to understand who we are and how we're made up was key to our deciding, I think, to buy their equipment.
Okay. These are a few things Boyd Cat has done in the last 5-6 years. We have 6 sites with East Kentucky Power, all landfill gas to electric generation. Owen Electric, we've had a unit running there, a 2 megawatt unit running at Owen for 3 years now on distributed generation. We say Toyota landfill, it's Toyota. The landfill is called Central Kentucky Landfill. They put a site in there that will handle up to 10 megawatt of power. And that power is generated from the landfill gas. They ran a line 5 miles back to the plant, and that green energy goes directly to the plant. Fort Knox, it's probably the biggest project we've done. That was installed 5-6 years ago. We put in 32 megawatt of power at Fort Knox, of which 4 gas 2 megawatt units are running 724 in a CHP application, combined heat and power. So we're taking electric off the back end, recovering the exhaust jacket water, providing facility heat. Some of that heat goes through an absorption chiller and is used for cooling in the summer. Vectren, utility in Evansville, they've been bought out by somebody. They're not called Vectren anymore. But we have a land site there with them. Farmers RECC, it's a pretty old installation. They have a couple diesels there. They pretty much use them if PJM calls up. And we've gone as far as we have a unit running down in Campbellsville, Kentucky on chicken manure digester. So a lot of things you can do with really a spark ignited engine. Fort Knox, real quick, they're saving about $8 million a year with that project. This is what one of the Fort Knox units looks like. That's a 2 megawatt unit on the left, CHP, and on the right is their control room, much like you'll find in a utility SCADA system. So they can see where every KW is coming from, what generators are running, and tied into the same grid is a 2 megawatt solar system. That's what Owen Electric looks like. If you're familiar with Owen Electric, they're just up the road near Sparta, near the track. The unit sits right next door to their corporate building. That's what a EKP landfill site looks like at Bavarian Landfill. This is before it was expanded, but we've got 5 megawatt running there at that plant. That's what one of the Toyota units looks like. And a couple of shots of some recent solar we've done. That project was done through LG&E's, what they call their business solar program. LG&E owns the assets, hires someone like us to contract to install the system, and then the customer gets the energy savings and basically pays for the system over some long period of time. I hear 20 years. We just finished 2 months ago a site down at Maker's Mark at their rick houses. This is not at the distillery, just outside of there. This one here we're pretty proud of. School built from ground up, brand new design. It was installed about a year ago. Local engineering firm designed it. It's a net zero school, the only one in West Virginia. and using solar to help get them to net zero. So Caterpillar, unlike our competition, sells through dealers like ourselves. So there's 171 of us in 192 countries across the globe. It's a global company. About 150,000 dealer employees worldwide in 2,100 locations. And this basically separates us from the competition. We're local. We're here to support you. I'll walk you through the project from start to commissioning. And our competition doesn't have that local asset. Caterpillar processes 432,000 orders a day. We're lucky here geographically. Caterpillar has, I think it's 5 now, distribution parts warehouses scattered across the country. We draw out of a parts distribution house up near Cincinnati. So Boyd has a truck picking up parts every 12 hours at that parts. Parts are brought into Louisville, and then we distribute them amongst our facilities. So we can literally, if we don't have it, have a part here in 12 hours. Some of our other service capabilities across our enterprise. A little bit of background on us. 1913, Walker was founded in 1950. Long-standing companies in our community. We have 32 just electric power field technicians running across West Virginia and Kentucky. We have our own on-site fluid analysis lab here in Louisville. We can analyze oils, we can analyze antifreeze, we can analyze hydraulic fluids. That is huge today in maintenance of an engine. It's amazing what an oil analysis will tell you, and you trend that over time, you can prevent premature failures. We offer project site management, bulk lube services, equipment monitoring, like I say, trending and planning. Coolant, we're a mobile oil distributor. If you buy a Cat branded lube oil or hydraulic fluid, it was probably made by Mobil Oil anyway. So we stock a lot of oil. We ship bulk out to Fort Knox, and because of Fort Knox and their site permit that they had at the time, we had to put SCRs on the gas engines out there. So, of course, they use urea injection. So now we're stocking and supplying in bulk urea. Your plant, you put a plant in here, it'll have SCRs on the engines because of the horsepower and the tonnage at that site. Even though the engine raw exhausts will meet the federal standards as far as emissions, you'll need the SCR because of the total horsepower site permit. That's kind of it. Other than that, I just wanted to mention a couple other things. If you talk to Northwestern, you talk to the folks in Minnesota, both of those people have built 2 plants. Both of them have selected Caterpillar on both of their plants. In the case of Northwestern, the most recent contract, they've had a plant running since I think 2005, and it was Caterpillar. So you got to say to yourself why, and it's really all about local service support that the competition doesn't offer. You know, if your plant was to go down, we probably have a guy within an hour distance to support you. If the Wärtsilä goes down, they're going to fly a guy in from Houston or Helsinki to service you. Downtime can be very costly. So that's kind of what we're all about, what we have to offer, and would love to work through this with you. In addition, Northwestern and one of the two plants that Minnesota did, they were both done by the same EPC contractor, a company called Fagan out of Minnesota. They're a very upstanding company. They build power plants to ethanol plants. They're on a wind project in Missouri right now. Just completed a 525 megawatt wind project. So we're good partners. So Northwestern, when they solicited their project, they separated the engine, generator equipment, and ancillary equipment from the EPC contractor. They didn't go out and hire an engineer, which is very costly to design it. They gave that design build to the EPC contractor. And so in essence, they save themselves a lot of money, because if that equipment goes through the EPC contractor, you're going to be paying another markup again. I'm going to sell you, Caterpillar's going to sell you at the same price we're going to sell that EPC contractor. It's just a way to cut the middleman out.
So lead time. So if you were to said, and let's just say 40 megawatts, if you wanted to get 40
Yeah.
megawatts in like Minnesota did, what would that take?
Engine generators right now are 10 to 12 months.
Okay.
Construction, as I understand it, and I got this from Fagan, who knows best, the contractor, we're looking at complete through commissioning 12 to 14 months. Now, keep in mind, you can have both of those going on simultaneously, but 12 to 14 months on a project.
Staffing? I know it depends on how many engines you have and all that, I'm sure, but.
At the plant,
Right.
that depends on how you guys want to operate this. These engines are so low maintenance requirements. In fact, I was looking at that this morning. There's 2 or 3 services that are required every 2,000 hours on these engines. So say 4 trips a year, if they were running base load, 8,000 hours a year. So it'd be 4 services a year, and there's an 8,000 hour check in addition. So, and that 8,000 could be done with the other 4. From there, the next service interval beyond those every year is at 16,000 hours. That's almost 2 years of running. So the plant can be operated remotely.
Or no operators at all on site?
I personally think it's good if an operator's on staff, 7/24. It's amazing what the human can see, hear, or smell that you can't get if you're totally operating remotely. Now, Fort Knox, they have 6 sites taking care of 32 megawatt of power. They have 1 operator, and he's only there a single shift, and they have 2 maintenance guys, hands-on guys. But there's a lot more service to those engines too. So I think it'd be good to have an operator on site. And if you want to contract out with us, we'll do all the service work. If you want to hire a service tech, he can shadow our guys, learn the first year. We can send them to Caterpillar school and get them trained up. So that varies on how you want to operate the plant, how you want to invest in people, if you don't want to invest in people. I know of a company right now that's they just built a 50 megawatt plant. It's kind of an investment company, and they want hands off after it's built. They just want the revenue. So they don't do any hands-on, have any operators at their plants at all, and operate them remotely, send a guy in when necessary. And like at Fort Knox, those guys can't be at every facility all 7/24, so they have cameras in each facility too. And I'm talking about eyes, ears, and smell of that human. I think it's good if you have an operator, 7/24 there, hands-on, he knows what's going on. but you could do it all remotely. And again, we have the interface to interface with a system here, with a SCADA system at a utility plant like Owen. We interface with their SCADA system. They can see everything. That unit at Owen, although it's 100 yards away from their office, they monitor everything remotely. Yeah. Yeah.
So Steve, does Paul do anything with hydrogen fuel cells or other hydrogen generators?
No, not currently. I know they're testing hydrogen fuel in a spark ignited engine. They have a lab in Peoria, and they don't test an entire engine. They actually have a cylinder they test it in. I don't see anything in the recent near future on that. Hydrogen in an engine is a touchy thing, very touchy thing. But they have no hydrogen fuel cells. Nothing that I know of is coming. Technology coming from them is more on the energy storage side. Caterpillar has an investment arm. They invest in future technologies. I can tell you they've invested enough where they have a person on the board of this company. They've invested in future solid state battery technology. So that might be coming. And they are getting pressure on the other side of their business in terms of equipment, mining equipment, to come out with electric equipment. It scares them to death to send a lithium-ion battery underground. Okay. The problem with, lithium-ion is the technology everybody's using, but lithium-ion can run away. It's got to be contained in an ambient atmosphere. Yeah. So, other than that, integration is big for us. Like I said, we can integrate this plant with some controls with the solar system. Other technologies, I don't know. Yeah.
All right, very good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Very good, Steve. That was terrific to hear about that technology. We want to talk about moving on then to our potential portfolios now that we've covered some of the resources, potential resources and transmission and so forth. Let's start off with our needs. Resource transmission needs. Starting in 2023, we have some needs. You'll notice I have Benham and Berea listed on there. Benham and Berea are participating in this planning process, and they would be eligible to be part of the group in 24 when their contracts expire if they chose to go that way. So that's why you see a bump up in the load. The dotted line is the load. The solid line represents the peak load plus reserves on top of it. I said 15% reserves, and I put the word minimum in there. The word minimum is important because as we watch what's going on in MISO, as more intermittent resources come on the system, there's a need for a higher reserve margin to capture that uncertainty. So it's something we'd want to keep an eye on to make sure we have enough reserves available. Rob's pointed out numerous times as he's talked about we need firm transmission to deliver to our system. So reserves are an important part of our planning process to make sure we have adequate reserves, both either transmission-wise or internal resources. We'll have a decision in 2027 when a 62 megawatt of transmission expires. In 29, we have some other contracts going away. And in 29, we're down to just renewable resources at that point, and of course, well below our peak. We just have our Ashwood and the SEPA hydro. So if you look at supply side resources, solar with battery, paired with battery is an option that's inside the system. We could also look at solar inside MISO and bring it over on firm transmission. Wind in MISO and bring it over firm transmission, combined cycles, the same thing. And buy from the market. That's an option as well. That has a risk as inherent to it, of course, as they're locked into a firm asset or contract. But you could hedge it. I also talk about natural gas resources, the Caterpillar units we just talked about. There's an appeal to those for a number of reasons. A quick start, ability to follow loads, one of them. The other one is you don't have to purchase firm transmission from MISO. You defer all that cost because you're building inside the system. If there's a combined cycle unit built inside our system, we can participate in. As Rob talked about, we perhaps have interest in that as well, depending on the economics, but we certainly know there's not a lot of opportunities to do that. But those are all things we want to consider and understand as part of this planning process. On the demand side, more and more distributed energy resources. We're going to see rooftop solar. These are things we don't necessarily have influence on with our customers. If they decide to put solar panels and battery storage, we want to understand that and understand how it affects our needs to serve load, if there's any changes we need to make. Certainly energy efficiency changes and could shift some loads around. And we think a big one that our members will be involved with is more and more AMI. So advanced metering infrastructure, the ability to know more about your customer's load. Someday we'll see time of day pricing perhaps, where there's a price signal, just like we get a price signal from the market. Our customers could get a price signal and decide they want to not run their washing machine at that hour and save money. Now, we know we've talked about this for a long time, this kind of technology, and it's sometimes bothers people to have a new rate structure in place. So we always have to carefully consider the consumer wants and desires when you go into something like that. But advanced metering infrastructure is great for rolling trucks on an outage and billing the customers and turning them on and off. But there's all kinds of other opportunities that go with that capabilities and technology as well. Encompass modeling. So the Encompass modeling excuse me, is all it looks at everything. So it builds units when it needs them. So it looks at a certain time period. If you have a 20-year planning horizons, it looks across there. It incorporates the constraints of environmental programs. So if you had an environmental program that said you can only emit so much carbon, or you want a carbon rate, meaning pounds per megawatt hour, you could put that in. It, of course, incorporates on top of that unit commitment of the existing and new units. So if there's a unit that has to run for 6 hours minimum and then has to be turned off for 4 hours minimum before it can start again, or there's starts per day, all that kind of commitment's important to run a model, because if you don't capture all the nuances of a unit commitment and dispatch model, you've perhaps priced it wrong or looked at it in the wrong light. Energy ancillary services, the ability for some ancillary services, let's start with that. The ability for some units to carry spinning reserve, that is, there's enough length in the system in that resource to be able to pick up load in case we have hot weather come through and we didn't buy enough over the interface, for instance. That's a unit there. We also look at our transmission, where we leave what we call spinning reserve on transmission on that transmission line. In other words, there's some length on that line to pick up and serve load as well. We can't run our system right up to the top all the time, because then we don't have any room to maneuver. And so the reserves operating and spinning are important, as is regulation up and regulation down when you have an intermittent resource like the Ashwood project. And that could lend itself to battery technology, for instance. So we can model batteries in this system as well. We also model demand side resources, demand peak clipping, for instance, or energy efficiency shifting. And we can model that so it looks just like a resource. So they're chosen on a one-to-one basis. They're both on equal footing. And of course, unit outages, if you have units that are subject to forced outages, maintenance outages, that's a key part of the overall system. So for those of you locked in your house with a teenager during COVID, you might have been looking at some math problems. And the math problems are you get equations and unknowns. And they would say, why, my math teacher gave me something that's not so absolute. And they might say, for instance, on this one, I got x plus 3y equals 6. I got 5x plus 2y equals 10. I got x equals 6 minus 3y. And you said, we need to figure all this out. Well, what happens in linear programming, and this is what Encompass does, it said, I have a system with mathematical equations, because that's what everything boils down to. I need to find a feasibility region. That's this shaded area. That's a linear program. In other words, I can have partial pieces. If you look at the solution to this one, x is 1.38, y is 1.54. That's fractional, or part of the solution. It's not a pure integer. And we'll get to that concept next. But if I have this feasibility region, I can bound it, and then I can minimize or maximize that region. In our case, we're trying to minimize cost in Encompass, so it would say, well, here's my feasible region where I can operate in. I need to find the solution within that region, and then it translates back and said, well, here's the units you built that minimizes that solution. Mixed integer linear program is a different animal, because when you design a power system, the solution is often requires integers. Steve just talked about it. If you have a certain size unit, you buy 1 engine, 2 engines, 3 engines, but you're not going to buy half an engine. There's no such thing, right? So if a single CAT unit's 10.3 megawatts, it's either 0 or 10.3, or if you want 2 of them, it's 20.6 and et cetera. Those are the feasible sizes. So the model's going to need to decide, I can't do a fractional once. I need to do a mixed integer. I need to have an integer solution for the units, but maybe I can have a partial solution or less than an integer solution for the amount of transmission I need, because I can go out and buy something not in a set amount. So instead of 250 megawatts of transmission, it could be 242, for instance. Also, this applies to solar units. So let's say you have economies of scale, and if I have a 30 megawatt solar site, it's a certain price. If I have a 60 megawatt site, it's a different price. Okay, those are very discrete numbers. So when a developer offers that, they're not going to let you say, well, you can put in 34 and we'll split the difference. They're going to say, here's the sizes that we're offering. So we want to put those types of sizes in the models as well, and let them model choose in that case. So in order to accomplish this, Encompass uses something called an integer branch and bound technique along with the linear programming. And it's a concept that's a solver routine inside Encompass, but it said, I'd start off with this non-integer solution. I said, what's my best solution if I were to be able to break up those Caterpillar units into smaller pieces? It said, that's the best I can do. Then it said, okay, now I can't do that anymore. I have to have an integer solution. If I put in 1 engine and I walk down the path and I branch off 2 different directions and I put in 2 engines, and it keeps adding and said, is the solution getting cheaper and cheaper? If I hit a red circle, that means, well, that's infeasible. I got outside the bound like I described 2 slides back. I can't solve. If I hit a black circle, that said, well, that's not as good as the place I came from, so go start down a different path and see if you can find a better solution. So it's constantly going along until it finds the least cost solution. It said, I'm done now. I can't find anything better than the solution I just found. And so that's what branch and bound means. And the reason we go through this is the understanding that sometimes it seems simple to exactly size something for your system. And it's stated that, well, geez, why'd you buy too much transmission or too much capacity? You said, well, that's kind of the choice we had. We had to buy a little more reserves in this year because we anticipate growth into it 3 years later, and we knew that opportunity wouldn't be there 3 years later. Or there's an economy of scale to buy a little bit more to start with. And so there's a lumpiness that goes into planning, just like there's a lumpiness that goes into everyday life. If somebody builds a department store, they might build it a little bit bigger, anticipating more customers moving into that region, or a gas station, or a grocery store, or even the KYMEA office. We anticipate we didn't buy it, build an office or release a space for a certain amount of people. We leased it for the board's needs now and in the future. So that's the point of trying to understand the timing of and sizing of things. Selecting projects. So the projects are selected using an objective function of minimizing cost. But with that minimization of cost, there can be a lot of policies that said, well, you got a carbon limit you want to try to hit. You might have some renewable portfolio standards. We want to have a certain amount of reliability. And when we stack things up, we love having low cost, but we have to be reliable. We have to be able to serve our members who are going to serve their customers. You can't go to your customer base and say, we really got you a cheap price here, but you're going to have to expect a lot of outages over the next 10 years. Nobody would want that. Everybody would say, well, can I pay a little bit more and have reliable service? And that's the desired outcome. So reliability is very important for us. And around those criteria of reliability, then we're saying, well, how can we minimize the cost and have stable rates? In Encompass, you can be thought of as type and timing. What type of resource, what type of fuel, what type of emissions are you getting out of it? Where's the location at? And the timing. When's it going to come online? What's its operating life? Ideally, you'd like it so if you have purchase power agreements or units, they don't all expire on the same day, or they don't all start on the same day, that you're putting them in piecemeal throughout some planning horizon. Said, I have things dropping on and off. We know when we go back to our no regrets or least regrets planning criteria, there's most likely 20 years from now technology we don't even know about yet. There's a good chance of it. Or if we do know about it, it's going to get way cheaper or way better than we ever dreamed it would. Solar is a good example. Solar was very expensive for a very long period of time, and then it just drops a lot. We see that with battery technology. So we know we have to do something now to secure our future for reliability, but we don't want to tie it all up that we don't have flexibility 10 years, 15 years down the road. So timing is as important often as type, that you would sacrifice a type for the short term. Maybe you do a purchase power agreement, or maybe you do some just buy from the market in the short term in hopes of something a little better in the long term. And those are things that we would present to the board and give them the pros and cons of each alternative strategy, and let them decide what feels comfortable for their communities. So that's the portfolio overall. The reason I showed the graphs about how Encompass chooses these is it's very mathematical. It goes through and it optimizes the portfolio. It exhausts every combination and said, here's what we're going to do. If we were to go down a path of a zero carbon emissions scenario, that might not be an optimized scenario that comes out of Encompass, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have merit to look at it. And let's talk about that scenario. But first of all, let's talk about the shifting U.S. mix. This is from our Encompass market model, where we modeled all the United States and using Horizons Energy. It's a firm that we subscribe to their database and their market price forecasting service. In 2000, you'll see the mix of resources was 76% coal and nuclear. So that was the energy that came out of those two technologies was 3/4 of the U.S. output. That's in the U.S. and excluding Canada in this case. You'll watch it drop through time. We're in 2020 now, and you can see how that curve is narrowed. In their base case, in their reference case, they expect that combination to be down to 7% by 2050. Nuclear power plants, 40-year life, have been getting a 20-year extension. Some of them are asking for another 20, so they're getting 80 years. But by and large, you're going to say, well, they're going after 60 years, they're probably going to go away. And there's a couple of nuclear plants being built right now, and they're struggling on delays and cost overruns. And I'm not sure people are going to try to go down that path again, at least for a while. Pebble bed nuclear reactors, a different technology, maybe is promising, but it's certainly very new. But the coal retirements, nuclear retirements driven by economics, and you'll see they're replaced by that big green area, a lot of combined cycle units. Very cheap gas drives a portion of this. Renewables, they get cheaper through time. You can see the orange and the green through time increase as well. That shifting mix takes carbon from by 2050 to 50% of what it was in 2005. Now, remember, those were big numbers people talked about a few years ago, and people were wringing their hands saying, oh my gosh, how are we going to get down to a 50% by 2050 under 2005 levels? This is from cheap natural gas and competitive wind and solar, and maybe a few states that have RPS levels, renewable portfolio standards. But it's organically achieved. There's no carbon tax. There's no cap and trade. There's no overall cap on carbon in this case. It's just driven down by economics. So you'll see that's just naturally occurring in their base case. And it's pretty realistic. You'll notice where we're at on that chart. We're almost there to that 2050 level in 2020. There's not much left to go. So that's a very interesting combination, because you're swapping out natural gas and losing nuclear. So it's just kind of hanging in that area. So if we wanted to talk about a zero carbon, which is what this section what we're talking about here is, let's gray out the first area up until the year 2029 in our portfolio. Remember, before I mentioned we're down in 2029, we're at hydro and solar, and that's all we have left, and we have a big blank slate right then. So Ashwood and SEPA Hydro. So you say, well, there's a point in time where we could say, have a scenario that said we are net zero carbon by June of 2029 or starting at that time period. So we looked at a scenario and said, what would that look like? And we'd actually had two of them developed. There could be others that we'll work on. Scenario one is solar. So we got 54 megawatts of Ashwood. We'd add another 75 megawatts of solar inside the system, LG&E system, 350 megawatts of wind. We have our 32 megawatts of SEPA Hydro, and it's a pretty big pipe we have to have up to MISO, 275 megawatts of transmission. So in the net zero scenario, our carbon neutrality begins in June of 2029. Carbon neutrality refers to achieving net zero carbon dioxide emissions over the course of an entire year. So at any given hour, you could be emitting carbon in the form of buying power that has carbon with it. But over the course of the year, you said, well, what we bought, what we sold, I'll show a graph on this, nets out to be zero. So we would call ourselves a net zero carbon footprint. We're buying and selling excess to and from MISO. Well, how do we size that? Remember, solar, it's going to be best when the sun's highest. So you got a June 21st, 22nd. That's the most sunlight, hopefully, if there's not a cloudy day. And then when you get to in December, there's not near as much sunlight. So you're going to, through the course of a year, you have less solar then. You'll notice wind generation tends to be better in the off-peak hours, in the evenings, 3 o'clock in the morning, starting up maybe at midnight again, drops off during the middle of the day. It's certainly more in April and those types of months as well. So even though I'm showing an average day across 365 days, there's bumps up and down of this thing where it could be very close to zero. There'll be some days it's way above of it, but that's the average. So when we sized out how much of solar and wind we wanted to minimize the amount that goes over our average load, which is the white line. Okay, so what that looks like, back to our graph again, is you'll see 75 megawatts of new solar inside the system. We got our 54 megawatts of Ashwood, or 32 megawatts of SEPA, and then we're taking 350 megawatts of wind up in some site far up in Indiana, probably getting closer to Chicago. That's one of the nearest wind sites. And we have something called congestion again that Rob talked about. So congestion means, and let me explain a little bit, go back how MISO works. If you have a generator in MISO, you sell everything at that node. Doesn't matter if you have load inside MISO, 50 feet away. You're selling everything to the market. You're buying everything from the market. The distance between that 50 foot away from your load and 50 miles away from your load is congestion. The farther away you get, that congestion number tends to get larger. So in essence, what we're really not doing is we're not sending the power from the wind generation right to the interface point, but it's a offset. We're selling all the wind at the wind point. We're buying back what we need for our load at the LGEE interface. Very similar to what we do right now with Breck Wilson. The difference between those two of what we sold for and what we bought it back for, the differential is congestion. It tends to be a little bit larger, a lot larger for wind sites, only because there's only so many good wind sites and all the wind developers tend to build there. So it depresses the prices where wind is, and then the rest of the prices are kind of at a normal location or normal price. And Rob had a really good graph on that he showed earlier with the deep blues. Now, and we're not saying that happens every hour, but we're saying congestion can get very wild, like hundreds of dollars or approaching thousands of dollars between nodes. It's a kind of remarkable thing to watch. And the purpose of that whole locational marginal price inside MISO is to send a price signal to say, well, we need more transmission between these 2 points because we are congested. That's the whole point of it. So there's a method behind why those prices get the way they are and what they're trying to accomplish. Okay, so the hourly interactions, you'll see there when we're short and purchasing, that's almost 275 megawatts. That's the size of transmission line we bought. On the other side of it, when we have excess, we're selling that excess wind into the market. That represents the below the dotted line, and that's up to almost 350 megawatts. So there's a lot of hours. We got lots of wind blowing. Didn't really need it here. And so in essence, it all just gets sold into the market. There's no congestion between the 2 points because maybe perhaps we weren't even selling wind, or in essence selling wind from the wind point to us. We didn't even need any off-peak wind, that kind of idea. So there's so when you look at that, those types of ebbs and flows, you'll see there's a huge interaction in the MISO market. If you look at just the transmission line from LG&E or through the interface, LGEE interface, the point-to-point we would need to be 275 megawatts. That's loaded up to about a 51% capacity factor. Now, the first thing you'd notice on a graph like this is there's a very much of a needle peak on that transmission line. You would try to find ways to clip that peak down. It could be through some demand-side management program. If you could get customers to shed load in that time period, you could pay them a certain amount. But there's some ability to maybe put a battery, something in to try to clip that peak down, because that's a lot of transmission you're buying for a full year just for that needle peak. And not surprising, that's what happens with resources as well. So if we look at our energy mix, 76% of the native load needs of KYMEA would be solar, wind, and hydro. Remember I said this is a 100% case, so how can that be? Well, we're buying 24% of the energy from the MISO market. So if you just looked at, if you added up all the hours where power is flowing into our system, we got 76 plus the 24, because otherwise we would have had to oversize everything to get it to be 100%. But we said that extra wind we have, we were selling that into the market, and so that's a credit as well, and that offsets. So you'll see the energy we are buying from the MISO market, 388,000 megawatt hours, was offset by the energy we sold into the MISO market. So adding those two together, that said, well, over the course of the year, we are netting zero for our zero carbon case. But 31% of the wind that we put in gets sold into the market. So it's important to note, often when somebody says, hey, we're 100% renewable, somebody would say, the counter argument is, yeah, you weren't 100% because you relied on the market. We would rely on the market, but that doesn't mean you haven't offset your entire load with non-carbon resources. It just means you had to have an extra resource to help you balance out and serve your load. And so that's the point of those two graphs, to kind of show how net zero works. So what's the takeaways? First of all, we achieved our net zero carbon case in that design. We have low-cost renewable energy on the system. We have a large exposure to market prices in MISO, both when we're selling excess wind, we're probably would be getting hurt pretty bad a lot of hours, and when we're buying when we need it, there's an exposure there. Some of that can be hedged out. Some of it's a little tougher to hedge out. It's easier to hedge at a liquid hub like an Indiana hub. It's harder to hedge at locations like a wind site, for instance. That would be a little tougher. It requires substantial point-to-point transmission. It'll likely lead to more distributed energy resources. Remember the feedback loop I showed this morning that said when your prices change, your rates change, it affects your load? There could be such a price signal that said, this is and I don't know if how expensive this case will be versus the others, of course we'll run it. But if there's a penalty or premium on top of it, and somebody said, geez, I can put in my own distributed energy resources instead of going down this path, it would lead to that. And that's fine if that's, but that would be the feedback we would need less of a resource if consumers or customers are putting in their own solar panels and batteries. Managing the intermittency of wind and solar is difficult since we're not in an RTO. So we talked about it before just on Ashwood and how we kind of smooth that out. And the Ashwood RWE team gave a good demonstration or talk about how they use batteries to smooth out some sites. Well, this is a pretty big smoothing, right? So if you're 100% non-carbon, that's a lot of smoothing of the intermittent resources. But it's doable. That's one of the things you want to certainly look at, but it could be take a lot of batteries. And so energy storage such as batteries becomes more valuable. So on that topic, the second scenario would be, why don't we put more generation, more solar, instead of 75, put 150 inside the system, cut down on the wind from 350 down to 300, take the MISO transmission from 275 down to 200, and put 90 megawatts of batteries in. So that's less dependent on the market than the first scenario, requires less MISO point to point. So that's another case to look at and to see what its impact would look like. So if you looked at that case graphically, very similar. It just shows the shifting of more internal generation inside the KU system. That gets us through the portfolio. So once you develop your portfolios, the model's going to pick some. We're going to custom create a few as well. Then we want to assess those portfolios with uncertainty. So that goes back into what we talked about before, the least regrets case. When you model the entire United States and you want to understand how policies, pricing affects everybody else and how that's going to affect us. If you do it in a bubble, if you plan in a bubble and don't just ignore that, you missed out on a big part of what drives our future rates. So we want to understand unit additions, retirements, generation mix, the load growth, fuel prices, carbon, all those things. Horizons Energy put together 9 cases we've been talking about where you have different cases of high and low load growth, natural gas prices, different carbon scenarios. They're a reference case that I showed earlier about how nuclear and coal is shrinking through time. And what the scenarios tell us is they're not predictions. They're not saying, hey, this is going to happen, one's going to happen over the other. The purpose is to challenge your mental map. In other words, get you thinking outside of your comfort level, perhaps, or what generally tends to happen, and I've done a lot of planning through the years, whatever's happening right now, that's what you tend to think is going to happen over the next 20 years. It's just the human nature. Stock markets, people feel the same way. Every time the stock market keeps going up and it finally goes down or crashes, we all seem amazed that it happened. And in reality, that's always happens. It's going to happen again. I can guarantee it. I can't tell you when it's going to happen. I wish I could, or I wish I could tell myself. But that is going to happen. And the same things are going to happen with technology changes. Some scenarios going to happen with legislation or policies. So we just want to think through those cases and not be over optimistic. Don't be over pessimistic. We always tend to look at the worst cases. Well, there's some good cases too that perhaps are out there. That's going to give us good insight to what we're trying to accomplish in our portfolio and give us some better decision making. Is it a robust portfolio? Critical decisions. We talked about the storylines and timelines and how those are put together. Are they plausible futures? If they are, then that's how we want to see how we're affected by those. So the demand cone, I talked about a cone shape before. Remember, this is so over time, demand could grow, it could shrink, you lose more and more demand. That kind of bounds it into these 9 cases. Natural gas prices, so we could have certain cases where they just go through the roof. We have another case, that blue line almost looks like an axis, but it's where it says through time, ignoring inflation, gas prices stay at a very low level. And so inflation adjusted, that means they're, in real terms, they're losing growth. That's possible. We've seen gas prices really plummet, and perhaps it's going to be cheaper and cheaper to keep extracting gas from the ground. The base case tends to be the ones in the middle there where there's some flattening and then it gets harder and harder to harvest gas or there's more uses for it. Remember that green graph I showed before where the combined cycle's coming in, that's a lot more gas usage than we're looking at early on. There's got to be some definite impacts of burning that much gas or exporting the gas overseas through LNG process. Carbon prices, we've been looking at carbon. So I've been doing resource planning since 1990. I pulled out an old study I did. We were looking at carbon back then. So there's not a carbon cap and trade market. There are a few scattered markets in the U.S. and so forth, but it's not a nationwide thing. Maybe it doesn't need to be. Even if you're someone who wants to reduce carbon, you'll see it's happening very naturally just because of the low price of natural gas and the cheaper renewables. There's usually some devastating effects on the economy of putting a carbon tax on, and certainly our customers and our members for them to have to pay for a carbon tax. But there are cases you've got to consider it and see what the impacts are. If you look at the power sector overall then, the 9 cases we're talking about, there's none of them that shoot carbon up over and above what it's ever been. So they're all on a downward path. The lowest one, the least reduction is 42% on the low natural gas case. That means natural gas prices were so low that we looked at earlier that it just builds a whole bunch of combined cycle units. It also sees cases where we get clear down to the 80%. There isn't a case here that looks down to zero carbon by 2050. I know that's been discussed. We're probably not there yet in technology trying to do that. I think it might be pushing the envelope for getting down to the 80. The concern everyone has is the resiliency of the system, be able to serve load, but also the intermittency and the swings in the system. Because if you have wind or if you have solar, it's all going to drop off in certain regions all at the same time. So the coincidence of forced outages on a technology is something like we've never seen before. It used to be a unit was a standalone, and if it was forced out, had nothing to do with yet another unit unless it was a transmission line or something like that. Now we're going to see something a little more less diverse, and cloud cover, rainy, stormy days could cover a big swath of an area. Once these plans are developed, we come up with our outcomes, and so we want prices, and we want capacity prices and energy prices and all the things that would develop out of a national model to put into our portfolio model. So when we look at our own system, and then we run them through this optimization model. So I just kind of showed 9 different cases running through. There's other cases besides those 9. There might be some that we look at it and said, you know, those 3 are all carbon-based. One's good enough for us to understand the impact of carbon. We might trim that down. There's a trade-off. The more cases you do, the more simulation time you have, the more things you have to look at. So there's often where you want to trim it down to something that covers the spectrum without having too many cases, something that's manageable. So that's what we're looking at. When do you want to build and purchase, buy, and you're going to go over a time period. And that's the type and timing issue again. Then we identify the uncertainty. So once we have those cases, we said, now I'm going to take each of those cases that was built by the model, and now I'm going to run it through and look at uncertainty. In this case, we're looking at a long-term demand draws. So deterministic, there's 2 items to think of here. Deterministic case, that's the fundamental case using the base case assumptions. We have perfect knowledge of the future on the deterministic case. Exactly know what everything is. Stochastic case is a random set of draws around fuel prices, emission prices, market prices, outages, those types of things. These are all the uncertainties we deal with in real life. We want to understand how that affects our portfolio. So these are draws from the Latin hypercube that I talked about earlier. That's a stratified Monte Carlo distribution. So you have a distribution that said, I'm going to take a slice of a bell-shaped curve or a log normal curve and understand if I take equal slices out of it, here's my draws. So this is always a good example to look at for long-term demand draws, for instance. Regulatory policy is somewhat stochastic and somewhat just kind of an off what if case, but we can identify a stochastic parameter around regulatory policies. For instance, we could have a carbon distribution that would capture the regulatory piece. So we take those, in this case, the example is, let's say we came up with 10 plans we wanted to carry forward. We take those 10 plans and we ran 25 scenarios or uncertainties on each of those. So these are random draws, these draws of loads and natural gas and market prices on each of those. So that's 10 cases times 25, that's 250 different possible paths on that. On each of those plans, then, you can create risk profiles and tornado charts, which our board is very in tune with right now. We did do that for our rate making, so they have an understanding of the breadth of a risk profile. That the fatter the tails you have, the more risk you have. If you have a risk profile that's straight up and down, you're risk averse. No matter what outcome happens, input drivers happen, your outcome stays the same, but that comes with a price. We understand there's inherently a risk in our industry of uncertainty, and that's fine. We just need to manage it. The tornado chart tells us the drivers. So it identifies each of those uncertainties we talked about earlier and said, which of these is the biggest driver on my portfolio? And if we did a tornado chart and we say, man, we're really exposed to natural gas prices, why don't we go take another look at what we're doing? Either we hedge out the gas price or we come up with a different technology to get away from the length of that bar. That would be something that we would identify and try to act upon. So that's the planning under uncertainty. In your slide deck, and I'm not going to go through these, but I think it's always useful if somebody gets online and said, I'm not familiar with the risk profile, or I'm not familiar with the tornado chart. We just give an explanation of what we're trying to accomplish and show with those. These are very powerful risk metric tools that allow us to assess and manage the risk of what we're trying to look at. So it's been an exhausting day, I believe, for everybody, and we had a tough start, but we're off and running now. And I think we're a little bit over time, but not much. So we will certainly be happy to entertain any Q&A from anybody for questions, answers. Heather, I think you're collecting them over there.
I do. I have one, Doug. Do you evaluate scenarios using battery storage?
Evaluate. Oh, would there be battery storage in a scenario? Yeah, there certainly will be, yeah. The battery learning curves that we're coming up with, and there's been some pretty good guidance. We watched what happened with solar, and over time, solar got cheaper and cheaper. The way we're modeling batteries is the same way. We believe the technology gets cheaper through time, so we're trying to match a curve that's been kind of published and put out. And so that'll be part of, if the model doesn't pick any batteries, we're going to pair batteries with some of our solar sites just to see the impact. The concerns we have with batteries right now is it's such a new technology. I mean, when you hear people talking about they got 170 megawatts total they put in, that's just not very many. And we'd like to have somebody else have the first experiences of how much you can cycle the units, for instance. They might not cycle as much. The discharge might not be what we think it's going to be. The life of the batteries might be different than we anticipate. So there's some nervousness about kind of a newer technology, but batteries have been around. And then certainly what Steve talked about, there's some safety hazards, just like anything with batteries and lithium ion.
How do batteries factor into your net zero carbon scenario?
So that's a good question. The scenario 2, I probably should have named him something else. Let's find it here. So it's scenario 2 of net zero. So there's 2 cases within there. We might, if people are interested, we might come up with other combinations if they have something else they think could work. But in this case, this is 90 megawatts of battery coupled with that 150 megawatt new solar that came in. So you put those 2 together, and it's going to do 2 things. So one of them, we're not as interested in peak clipping. I mean, that's fine, but we're really concerned about the intermittency of solar and trying to smooth it out. And just to let everybody know on this call, we have Ashwood coming in 2 years. We already have some monitoring out at that site where we're trying to gather data, understand what the cloud cover looks like, and the intermittency of solar for the site we already have. We can't take it lightly. If we were inside an RTO, it'd be different. There's an obligation to service in that area. We have to go through, and as Rob showed us very clearly, we have to tag everything that's coming in. And there are very strict rules about when you can do it, what times you can do it, and if you're all of a sudden missing 50 megawatts of solar, how are you going to make up for that? And then Reliability Council gets on you. So batteries could have a very strong part of our future. We just need to be very cautious with them and make sure they're ready for prime time and work both economically and physically.
Were you able to factor into your model an increase of electric vehicles?
It's kind of implied when we look at our scenarios that come from Horizons. So this is our demand cases. Our demand, baked inside those demand cases on Horizons, and that's the same type of growth path we're going to follow and when we develop our cases, we could see a high demand growth with a different profile. So the profile that on an hourly basis, what the load looks like will change, as will if a lot of electric vehicles come in the system. So we'll take a look at it. You know, I'm not even sure how many are in any of our member communities right now. There might be a way they're published, but and I'm sure it's very few, and that really has to do with the charging stations and other things. But it's something we understand that's probably got a somewhat bright future, and we want to make sure we account for it. We do have plenty of time to reassess that as we keep looking at anything we do in the long-term planning, because that's kind of down the road.
Does KYMEA plan to build a large power plant?
No. So anything KYMEA would build would be to serve our members' load. So for instance, if you look back at the graph we talked about before, we're going to be missing 60 megawatts in 2027. You'd say, well, what's the right size? It'd be somewhere in that neighborhood. It's not going to be exactly that number, the lumpiness as I talked about, or there could be some generation that we need to go over and above that to follow solar. But those are, we're not in the merchant power plant business, nor could we really be, because it'd be very difficult. First of all, our members would be dead set against it, rightfully so. But the second piece is, how would we even sell it into the market? There isn't a market here. That's why you don't see merchant developers come into a non-RTO region. So anything we do is going to be solely for the purpose of serving the member load. Well, thank you for attending today. It's getting kind of a long day for everybody, I'm sure, and it's a lot of information coming at you. Please use the feedback and send us questions if you have anything. If you want a personal call, we're happy to do that. This is we think it's a very good process. None of us is as smart as all of us is always a good saying we like to use. And if there's good ideas out there, we're all for that. So our next meeting for the community focus group, so we're going to roll up our sleeves, and I hope we're not too aggressive here, but we have a tight window. And by September 2nd, we want to have a lot of the simulations completed, at least preliminary numbers. And so on September 2nd, we're in this building on the lower level at our KYMEA building, Underwriters Building, from 10 to noon, and 1 to 3, we'll have a similar session to this, but it's going to be based on talking about results a little bit more and some of the findings we've had after making the simulations. Anything, Michelle, on that? Okay, and go to our website and fill out the form. All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.